So, good morning, and thank you for the honor of synthesizing the global energy revolution that's rapidly taking us towards a cheaper, resilient, and carbon neutral future. The overarching story here is a rapid and an irreversible global shift from fossil fuels to renewables, fuels to electricity, inefficient to efficient and ever more efficient use, and centralized to distributed supply. And together, efficient use, renewable supply, and electrification of heat and mobility are squeezing out fossil fuels from both sides. Their large fraction of global energy today is just as misleading a guide to their future as was the number of horses in 1900, just before cars displaced them. Now, energy planners tend to think linearly, but the new energy reality is exponential. And this new normal needs a new and agile mindset because it's really hard to catch an exponential curve from behind. Many traditional models are now dangerously misleading, and using last year's data, even maybe last quarter's data, can be hazardous to your financial health. Things are changing so fast. Here's one indication of that. Exponential growth in photovoltaics has so far outrun understanding that even the best short-term forecasters who track tens of thousands of actual projects worldwide had to raise by 64% or 173 gigawatts in a 20-month period spanning 2023, their forecast of how much PV capacity the world would install during 2023. That's an order of magnitude more forecast error than we're used to. And if even those top-tier analysts couldn't keep up with photovoltaic growth as it's happening because it flew past in such a blur, how risky are old data and models and mindsets for incumbents? Moreover, this year, China's capacity to make PV modules will rise from about 600 to 1,000 gigawatts per year. For calibration, last year the world installed about 443 gigawatts. That glut guarantees many years of rock-bottom prices as overbuilt makers worldwide seek cash flow by selling at or below cost. Last I looked, we were down around 11 US cents per watt per module. And some European prices now undercut other materials for building facades. A Swedish friend just wrote me it's worth sheathing his new house in Chinese PV modules even if they make no electricity. Such prices are going to keep driving solar levelized cost in this decade to a minor fraction of legacy thermal plants' short-run marginal cost, and that will speed load defection and grid defection. Here's how the world's electricity generation mix is flipping. The blue curve, modern renewables, that is all kinds except big hydro dams, grew faster in the past decade than the magenta nuclear curve's fastest growth back in the 1980s. Wind plus solar will overtake hydropower this year. Total renewables, 30% of global generation last year, now produce 3 times nuclear power's stagnant output. They've surpassed gas-fired generation. They should pass coal-fired generation next year, and they're continuing to accelerate. Modern renewables' first trillion watts, a terawatt, was in 2016. It took about 15 years to build. The next terawatt took 5 years and cost about half as much. The third terawatt took 3 years, till right around now. The next 5 years will see the world adding over 3 more terawatts, more than in the past century. China added more PV capacity in the last quarter of last year than in all the previous year, and more PV capacity last year than the United States has added cumulatively since developing the technology 69 years earlier. China will meet its 2030 solar and wind target this year, and its carbon emissions probably peaked last year. IEA predicts 42% renewable global electricity in 2028, 25% from variable renewables. And that clean supply can displace far more fossil fuel emissions far sooner if efficiency, meanwhile, shrinks demand. So the biggest story starts with the most formidable competitor using energy more productively. In the past 48 years, saved energy, about two-thirds due to smarter technologies, has dropped U.S. energy use by 64%, with an enormous cumulative saving. Meanwhile, renewables nearly trebled, but with 26 times less cumulative impact. Who knew? Renewables get almost all the headlines. You can see them on the rooftop, on the skyline. But energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. Yet saved energy is half the world's historic decarbonization, and it's at least half of future decarbonization. So when we leave it out, we're making the problem look twice as hard as it is. Around 1975, U.S. government and industry all said that primary energy intensity, total energy input needed to make $1 of GDP, could never go down. A year later, I heretically suggested that over the next 50 years it could go down by 72%. And so far, as you just saw, it's dropped 64% in 48 years. And yet, just the innovations already added by 2010 can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. And today that's looking quite conservative because optimizing buildings, vehicles, and factories as whole systems, not as little isolated parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns. And if vigorously applied, such integrative design could quintuple global energy productivity by around 2060 or treble it by around 2040, as documented in this foundational paper. I'll give you examples shortly, but I want to note this is only end-use efficiency, services per unit of final energy delivered to the user. That does not include the 2- or 3-fold upstream savings from electrification with primary renewables. So let's look at that first. 3 columns starting on the left illustrate that supply-side shift. At the upper left, the big conversion losses in red in thermal power plants are eliminated at the lower left when solar and wind power in green generate directly without a steam cycle. In the middle column, fuel combustion at the top provides heat several-fold less efficiently than a renewably powered heat pump down below, concentrating free low-temperature heat from the environment. And then in the right column, petrol and diesel engines with their big red losses are far less efficient than renewably powered electric motors in battery electric vehicles. So the systems across the lower row replacing fossil fuels with renewable electricity are several-fold more efficient in turning that energy into delivered services. But this does not yet include higher efficiency in the equipment being powered, or the material or building being heated, or the vehicle being moved. That's the end-use efficiency, and doing it first makes the heat pumps and EV batteries smaller, cheaper, less mineral intensive. Then both these kinds of efficiency multiply to form primary energy efficiency. The supply-side savings here of around 2- or 3-fold avoid nearly $5 trillion of global waste each year. That's almost 5% of world GDP. And yet they're only about half as important as the largely overlooked gains in end-use efficiency. Now, the world just agreed in Glasgow to double the speed of saving energy overall, and that's before including most of the integrative design. But integrative design can make the end-use efficiency resource several-fold bigger, but actually cost less because it uses not more but fewer devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. And it's not fancier devices, it's simpler ones. It doesn't add things, it designs them out. We're familiar with resources like copper ore bodies or oil reservoirs, finite and depletable assemblages of atoms. But in contrast, energy efficiency resources are infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Let me offer a few examples. My wife Judy and I live 2,200 meters up in the Rocky Mountains near Aspen, Colorado, where temperatures used to dip to minus 44 Celsius. The central atrium that our house wraps around, seen here in a winter snowstorm, has so far produced 81 passive solar banana crops. Someone said I have really big earphones. And it was cheaper to build this way 42 years ago because leaving out the heating system subtracted more construction cost than super efficiency added. Now, it doesn't have to look like this to work like this, but this house helped inspire several 100,000 European passive buildings with no heating and roughly normal construction cost. And then a Bangkok analog saved 90% of its air conditioning energy with better comfort and normal construction cost. Nearly everyone on Earth, and certainly everyone in Australia, lives in a climate somewhere between those of Bangkok and Old Snowmass. But wherever you live, integrative design gives many benefits from each expenditure, so the white arch at the top of the upper middle image has 12 different functions, but it has only one cost. In 2010, such integrative design let our Empire State Building retrofit save 38, later 43% of its energy with a 3-year payback. A major ESCO using disintegrated design offered the same 3-year payback with 1/6 the savings. Then 3 years later, our cost-effective retrofit saved 70%, making this difficult half-century-old federal complex more efficient than what was then the best new U.S. office, NREL, which in turn is only a third as efficient as RMI's net positive, no mechanicals, passive office near our home. It's now using about 1/9 the normal amount of energy in the coldest North American climate zone. Then there's this Bavarian building using 2/5 less energy still. Notice that all these technologies existed over a decade ago. What's mainly improved is not so much technology as design. And it keeps improving. The Dutch Energiesprong method of super outsolation, like putting a tea cozy around your building, can profitably retrofit most buildings to net zero efficiency in as little as a day, even without disturbing the occupants in a block of flats. Now, in Europe, IPCC reported that about a decade ago, the best new buildings on the left and retrofits on the right could save up to at least 90% of their energy use without costing more per unit of saved energy. The biggest opportunities show up clearly because when you realize that the biggest savings are towards the right, the lowest costs are towards the bottom, and you can see there are quite a few instances right along the horizontal axis that is almost no cost of savings. There is a big vertical cost scatter, but that only shows the business opportunity from conforming inferior projects to best practices. What about space cooling? Well, even in tropical climates, traditional passive building design can keep you feeling about 16 to 19 Celsius cooler. Redesign can treble to quintuple the efficiency of big mechanical space cooling systems, and the quintupled efficiency window air conditioners elicited by RMI's Global Cooling Prize are heading to market. But an experiment 5 years ago revealed a startling alternative to all of those. Purely radiative cooling kept people comfortable outdoors in Singapore without moving, drying, or cooling the air. Instead, in this shaded but open-ended pavilion, people stayed cool just by radiating their bodies far infrared rays into panels circulating slightly cooled water and shielded from the humid air by a thin plastic film. So radiant temperatures of 23 to 25 degrees could deliver comfort in air up to at least 32 degrees at 80% relative humidity. Such mild cooling, just 7 to 9 Kelvin below ambient, can often be done passively with no electricity, potentially about eliminating the world's long-term growth in peak electricity demand. Inside buildings are some other surprising opportunities. For example, this fist-size heat pump can deliver 6 to 15 units of hot water per unit of electricity versus, say, 3 or 4 normal in Australia. While this electric conduction cooking system, including vacuum pots, is 2 to 4.5 times more efficient than induction and otherwise superior. What about industry? It uses half the world's energy and electricity. Well, RMI's latest 60-odd billion US dollars worth of industrial redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit across a wide range of industries, paying back in a few years and far outperforming the oval orange zone in the upper left, where, alas, most energy service companies still deliver disintegrated design. In new projects, integrative design generally yielded 40 to 90+% energy savings with lower than normal capital cost in almost every case. How do you do that? Well, for example, half the world's electricity turns motors, half the motor torque turns pumps and fans. And just better pipe and duct design can save about 80 to 90+% of the friction and therefore of the pumping power and energy, 97% in our house. If everyone did this, it could save roughly half the world's coal-fired electricity, or a fifth of all electricity, rising to a third when combined with drive system retrofits in fluid handling. And the paybacks are typically under a year in retrofit and instant in new build. But this isn't yet in any standard engineering textbook, official study, industry forecast, or climate model. In fact, the only textbook I've seen it in is a little one on whole system design published in Australia in 2009. I hope it's still in print. Well, why isn't this everywhere? Just because it's not a technology. It's a design method. And few people yet think of design as a path to speed and scale. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. And notice that we've raised up the little blue pump on the right to meet the pipe rather than dipping the pipe down to meet a pump on the floor and then back up again. So that gets rid of 4 elbows. And to eliminate elbows and their friction, we also lay out the pipes first, then the equipment, not the other way around. So the 10 chillers originally in a neat row get staggered to lay out to make the elbows go away. So we're laying out supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend minds, not pipes. Now think of the whole power and pumping system. From the fuel burnt in the thermal power plant to the end use, many successive losses compound, so only a tenth of the energy in the fuel comes out the pipe as flow. But now turn those compounding losses round backwards from right to left, and they turn into compounding savings. So every unit of flow or friction you save in the pipe saves 10 units of fuel cost, emissions, and what Hunter Lovelace calls global weirding back at the power plant. And as you go back upstream, the components get smaller and cheaper, so the total capital cost goes down. Thus, our colleague Peter Rumsey's retrofit of the Oakland Museum's condenser water pumping loop in California cut its pumping energy by 3/4 with a 2 or 3 month payback, and it eliminated 15 pumps that will never again waste energy and maintenance cost. And then repiping the chilled water loop and adding variable frequency drives doubled the flow and saved 85% of the energy. Another example, in big buildings, normally we pipe cooling tower water back to the chiller's condenser like this. But if we lay it out instead the way Peter Rumsey does, everything gets better. Why don't we all do this? Force of habit, bad habits. Now let's apply the same logic to big old data centers. 2/3 of the fuel fed into the thermal power plant is lost in the plant and the grid. Half the metered electricity is lost in the cooling system and uninterruptible power supplies before reaching the servers. Half the server energy doesn't get to the chips because it's lost in inefficient, usually very underloaded power supplies and lots of superfluous fans. Next comes severe underutilization of computing resources, partly through insufficient virtualization. Well, the resulting energy flow, that tiny little yellow thing, is about to vanish, so let's magnify it before it goes away. Next comes bloatware, running many unnecessary threads and processes and making simple tasks very complex because compute cycles were considered cheaper than programmers' attention and someone else was buying the electricity. Downstream of all that, you may even have inefficient business processes. So in all, the red numbers at the bottom reveal that just a few hundred thousandths of the original fuel energy actually delivers customer value. Where should we start fixing this? Always downstream, start at the end. First, write elegantly terse code, optimally compiled, with the goal that every compute cycle is a needed and wanted one. I thought this might save an order of magnitude in compute cycles. Recent tests suggest it's 2 orders of magnitude. And of course, now that we're using a lot of mobile devices, efficient code becomes valuable because it stretches battery life. Then we can at least quadruple server energy, now even more than that, and the servers will need a lot less cooling and power supply. Both can be done in smarter ways. We could even save half the utility losses by using fuel cell trigeneration, cheaper than the UPSs it displaces. Well, if you multiply those savings from downstream to upstream, you cut the energy use by at least 2 orders of magnitude. And in the project for which we made this diagram 15 years ago, the client rejected most of our recommendations. So we were very disappointed. We could only treble the efficiency at the same capital cost. We hardly ever do that badly. But our partner EDS said that had they all been adopted, we would have saved 95% of the energy and half the capital cost. Now, even without most of the integrative design, U.S. electricity use, we found in Reinventing Fire 2011, could shrink 25% by 2050, despite all electric autos and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. This quadrupled electric end-use efficiency would save kilowatt hours for 1/10 their U.S. retail price. So this analysis should have bought much more efficiency than just 4-fold. And electrification doesn't necessarily make electricity demand soar. Just was running the numbers the other day. Using domestic hot water efficiently and getting it from a good heat pump could actually free up enough electricity to run your electric car. Now, over 32 years, shown here, Norway used only modestly more electricity as its car fleet became 30% electric. 60% of its relatively efficient housing stock adopted heat pumps, and its GDP more than doubled. That's a salutary tale for people planning to build a great deal more electrical supply. How much electricity will the world need? Well, nobody knows. The highest standard projections risk major overbuilding and stranded assets, and that risk, I think, is rising with the obvious trends plus further innovation. For example, in 2021, efficient structural design, more on that in a minute, with some new business models, emerged as a proven but very underused way to save half the world's steel and cement. In 2022, so did low-temperature ways, now pilot-proven, to make steel and cement, such as electrochemical iron making at 60 degrees C, like a hot cup of coffee, rather than at 1600 degrees. In 2023, geological hydrogen became credible, and it may end up saving most or all of the planned green hydrogen and the green electricity to make it. So we're rapidly entering a tricky period when we need not just deployment, but also discernment about how much of what supply we will actually need, what is a climate-effective investment, and what is a shiny object with a slick sales pitch. Meanwhile, of course, full speed ahead on both efficiency and renewables. The endgame details needn't constrain our opening moves. I'm just saying that anyone considering major long-term investments need to understand the full competitive landscape. Now, I just mentioned smarter structural design. A few examples. Substituting tension for compression structures typically looks better, costs less, uses about 1/8 the tons. Pouring concrete into curvy fabric forms, not rigid prismatic forms, can often save over half the concrete by putting strength and stiffness just where you need them. And then the weight savings compound because you need less strength to hold up less weight. An airy 3D printed bridge can carry mainly its users while massive concrete bridges support mainly their own weight. By the way, here's a 3D printed stainless steel bridge. Most importantly, floor slabs like this are about half the total weight of a typical mid or high-rise building. And a 5-centimeter thick corrugated or folded concrete slab like this, or a shallow vaulted dome, can replace a 30-centimeter thick flat slab, yet it costs less, and it saves 3/4 of the cement and all of the steel. Thin floor slabs and passive better energy design can save a further roughly 15% of core structural materials and 3/4 of the energy in a new mid or high-rise building like the Singapore example at the upper right, whilst increasing net rentable space by a stunning 55%. How? Well, look at the far left. You design out those 1-meter vertical plenum heights at each story by distributing their function into things you're building anyway, like glazings and ceilings. And that plus that passive design plus the thin floor slabs lets you fit, in the second diagram, 3 stories with a perfectly normal 2.8 meter ceiling height, unchanged from the left, into the vertical space previously required for 2 stories. Cost, complexity, and time all fall dramatically. Why would you build any other way once you see this? As we electrify mobility, remember that 2/3 of the energy needed to move a car is caused by its weight. Well, BMW showed how integrative design can lightweight a car at competitive cost, even at 2013 carbon fiber prices. So this i3 that I drive made money from the first unit off the assembly line. Its carbon fiber was paid for by the batteries, the avoided batteries that its lightness saved. And of course, fewer batteries mean faster recharging with less electricity, infrastructure, emissions, and investment. EPRI just found that's worth over $200 billion per year in the United States. This car's integrative design snowballs weight savings far more than usually assumed. Its manufacturing is radically frugal. It eliminates the 2 toughest steps in automaking. It's much better for workers. And its efficiency is quadrupled without compromise, with many driver advantages, of which my favorite is half the normal turn radius. But the next game changer could be 2 hypercars from small firms I advise, both production ready and now raising the rest of their production capital. Most drivers won't need to recharge this American carbon fiber 2-seat 3-wheeler or this Dutch metal 5-seat 4-wheeler, because they're about 3 times as efficient as a Tesla, so their topside solar cells capture enough energy for ordinary daily driving without plugging in, bypassing the charging infrastructure and its electricity supplies. The off-road version of the one on the left with the camper option would do very nicely in the outback, and both these vehicles can be further improved. Tesla's semi-heavy electric truck is 3 to 6 times more efficient than today's Class 8 fleet. Or what about aviation? This quiet omnifuel diesel air taxi with the Sydney to Tokyo range has 1/8 the operating cost and fuel use of a business jet. It can probably scale up to about 737 size. So aviation's on the same track as electric vehicles, but co-evolving even faster. And now a new kind of aerospace structure, a polymer lattice covered by a tough polymer membrane, can make metal aerostructures about 60 times lighter weight. Not 60%, 60-fold. Now add up all these and many other savings, and the hydrocarbon reserves unsellable for competitive reasons look bigger than the reserves unburnable for climate reasons, putting owners even more at risk from market competition than from climate regulation. The cost of getting U.S. autos completely off oil has fallen from $18 per saved barrel over a decade ago to under $7 today, and it's heading below zero over the next few years. So oil already became uncompetitive even at low prices before it became unavailable even at high prices. Now methane gas is on this track too, with every market under severe competitive threat. Now, decades ago, the industrialized world decoupled economic growth from energy growth, and now the same's happened for electricity. Here's the familiar Australian hedgehog graph, where GDP in red grew robustly for 17 years, whilst the official forecasts in white of electricity use from the national grid followed actual demand in green downwards, turning from growth to shrinkage, except a little in 2022, there's an uptick. This is due to both efficiency and on-site renewables, and those are just behind China and India in price. You did well. Your grid operators keep finding solutions faster than problems as customers take power into their own hands. You know, it's wise to sell customers what they want before someone else does. Customers are figuring out that they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and more timely, produce their own, and even trade them with each other. For example, Dutch customers can buy renewable electricity directly from other customers on this peer-to-peer website of Van de Bron, literally from the source. A friend of mine bought his electricity from the guy in the upper left photo because the price was right in magenta, and it's a really cute piglet. And then he got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. What big utility can dream of such customer intimacy? Indeed, powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. And these 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs. They multiply quickly, and they can gobble up half of utility revenues in this decade. Together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. A decade ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs, and the full quote is, "Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run." Who do you suppose said that? It wasn't Greenpeace. It was Union Bank of Switzerland. And now there's a whole new wave of Pac-Men coming over the hill, and more behind them. Now, rapidly expanding renewables may depend on decongesting the grid, and that makes a new type of advanced transmission conductor important, which, according to a new FERC ruling 2 days ago, will have to be considered. Full disclosure, I advise the maker of this device, so I'm not independent on this one as I am on the others. Compared to ubiquitous steel core aluminum conductors, this carbon fiber core, about 7 times stronger per unit weight, can double or triple the ampacity of this line with half the losses, better safety and reliability, excellent economics, and of course you can reconductor existing pylons with this wire. It's a very simple operation with standard tools, equipment, and training, and greatly decongest the grid. The next version will have an internal fiber optic sensor to boost ampacity to 3 or 4 times that of a standard steel core line by doing full dynamic loading. And that reconductoring of existing pylons can often avoid a new right-of-way to the relief of farmers. It can greatly reduce cost, risk, and time. There's a Berkeley study finding that an older and less capable type of advanced conductor than this one could nearly quadruple the U.S. transmission addable by 2035, and that could meet over 80% of the interzonal transmission needs to exceed 90% renewable electricity by 2035. This newer technology should do even better. So for stalled renewables and congested grids, help is on the way, and it could perfectly well be done here. Now, further unburdening transmission, decentralized generation is accelerating and should improve reliability and resilience. A century ago, generation was costlier and less reliable than the grid. Now the grid is costlier and less reliable than generation. Now big power plants cost more per kilowatt hours than small ones. Everything's flipped on its head. The economic logic of my 2002 book, Small is Profitable, is reflected in this forecasted 95% shrinkage of the median European power plant by 2050, when 2/3 of generation is expected to feed directly into the distribution grid. So Australia's leadership in rooftop solar at about half the US cost reinforces this beneficial decentralization and focuses grid upgrades on distribution. You've already proven that rooftop solar can go awfully fast. Here's an even more interesting example where Vietnam in 2 years built more solar power than, say, Spain or France have. And 9 of the 16 gigawatts they added in 2 years was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures. That's equivalent in output to building half of Vietnam's coal plants or more than New South Wales' total black coal capacity in 1 year, once the grid catches up. And by the way, 72% of that was installed just in the month of December, most of it in the last week of December, before the window closed on a juicy feed-in tariff. China's whole county rooftop solar program does centralized auction and batch installation across the rooftops of an entire region. Rooftop PVs were not a thing in China in 2017. 5 years later, they were 40% of the total and 61% of the new Chinese solar power, and 1 of every 4 solar panels in the world was on a Chinese roof. Globally, distributed solar got as much investment last year as utility-scale solar did and continues to soar. So quite exciting opportunities in distributed rapid deployment. All this means that we don't need speculative, slow, costly technologies like fusion or fission, except, of course, the well-engineered and remotely sited free fusion reactor already thoughtfully provided. However, we should be happy that it's 150 million kilometers away because sometimes it burps, and solar flares will sooner or later destroy any unprotected power grid, as many still are. We noticed a few days ago that next year's forecasted peak is arriving early. This season is expected to be one of the most intense ever. And against all these threats and more, our best protection is a portfolio of efficiently used, diverse, dispersed, renewable, resilient power sources, the right size for the task, especially right on our roof, not at the other end of a vast and brittle grid, and wired to work with or without the grid, as our house does. That resilient retail hookup under a standard that protects line workers like IEEE 1547 should be our routine practice, and it should be a crucial element of national security. Now, some in Australia seem to need reminding that carbon-free power is necessary but not sufficient. We also need it to be cheap and fast. So we need to count carbon and cost and speed. At actual market prices and deployment speeds, new nuclear plants would save many-fold less carbon per dollar and per year than cheaper, faster efficiency or modern renewables, and therefore would make climate change worse. Just operating, let alone further subsidizing, existing nuclear plants wastes money that could buy cheaper options, saving even more carbon. So the more urgent you think climate change is, the more vital it is to buy cheap, fast, proven solutions, not costly, slow, speculative ones. When someone says climate change is so urgent that we need all of the above, I think of Peter Bradford's reply. He said, "We're not picking and backing winners. They don't need it. We're picking and backing losers." That makes climate change worse. There aren't any proposed changes in size, technology, or fuel cycle that could change these conclusions. And they're intrinsic to all nuclear technology. Basically, nuclear is adding each year, and most as much global supply as renewables are adding every few days. So there's simply a delay and distraction. A climate non-solution is not worth paying for, let alone extra. Nuclear has no business case, it has no operational need, it offers no benefits for grid reliability or resilience that would justify special treatment. On the contrary, its inflexibility and ungraceful failures complicate modern grid operations because it hogs grid and market space that cheaper renewables are barred from contesting. A myth persists, though, that only coal, gas, and nuclear stations can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind and PVs are variable and hence unreliable. But variable doesn't mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in one stormy winter month a decade ago forecast the next day's output of the country's wind farms. They'd be pleased to forecast demand that accurately. And forecasting has since improved so much that the East Danish wind operators bid day-ahead wind power, into the grid's hourly auction just as confidently as fossil fuel generators do. Indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. Giant plants fail too. They lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, often for weeks or months. But grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. So in hot and often humid Texas, with a 99% isolated grid and no big hydro, a 20-50 weeks expected loads in the summer can get much smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and PVs, 14% from dispatchable renewables. Now we've got 100% renewable supply, but it's not a good match to the load shape. So to make them match up, we can put the surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed storage worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart bidirectional charging of electric vehicles, and then recover that energy when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. That yields 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year, and with no bulk storage, and with only about 5% left over to help decarbonize other sectors. So the economics would be excellent even at today's prices. Some grid operators are doing such choreography today. Germany, Britain, Ireland, Lithuania are half renewably powered. Denmark is well over 80%. Scotland about 100%. Already they and some other European countries out on the end of the grid in the Iberian Peninsula are getting about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electric needs from renewables without adding bulk storage, and with superior and rising reliability. For Denmark and Germany, it's 5 times as good as the United States. The 99.999% reliable East German former utility, 50 Hertz, was 65% renewably powered a couple of years ago, targeting 100% by 2032, all reliably integrated. So, as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. Now, in recent weeks, California's biggest power supplier has often been batteries for multiple evening hours, with over 10 gigawatts of big batteries meeting as much as 27% of demand. As of May 5th, the wind, water, and solar share has exceeded 100% of demand on the past 22 consecutive days, sometimes for 9 hours or more. And you have a similar success story, of course, at the gigawatt scale grid of South Australia, where the grid operator says it should run on 100% solar and wind in the next few years, up from the current world-class 75%. Here's the monthly history over 24 years, with solar in yellow, wind in green, already having displaced essentially all the coal imports in purple, and most of the methane gas, light and dark brown, with very successful and lucrative stabilization by big batteries. And the highest renewable oversupply was 264% of peak demand. Last October, wind and solar met 87% of the state's monthly total electricity needs. The stability and economics have been excellent, and this story and those of other pioneering states is inspiring global emulation. But despite such empirical examples, standard models say we need giant fossil or nuclear plants to keep the grid reliable as it becomes renewable. That's an artifact of omitting most of the grid balancing solutions. So here I've sketched 10 carbon-free ways, conceptually, to balance the grid across all timescales, not just big batteries in magenta and without needing fossil fuel backup in red. Now, your actual costs will vary. The point is that bulk storage comes last, not first. So we needn't wait for a storage miracle, although some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. Today's exponential battery growth could get global power over 60% of the way to net zero. SA's battery experience at 75% with its big batteries is outstanding, but that's not the only option. The first 2 boxes on the left, negawatts and flexawatts, are both several-fold bigger than had been thought, yet cheaper. Flexawatts alone have been demonstrated at 30 to 50% peak savings, and most other options remain neglected. So the giant batteries, currently the costliest option, are effective, they're valuable, they're profitable, but they're seldom actually necessary. Because 3/4 of US electricity, or half of Australian, powers buildings, making buildings more efficient can shrink and shift their peak loads, dramatically improving grid balancing. And NREL did an interesting study competing efficiency against storage, not against supply, and conservatively found that better building efficiency can cut investments by an order of magnitude by displacing most or all of the long-duration hydrogen storage and the green electricity to produce it. Another objection sometimes raised to renewables is long, calm, cloudy periods, like the dreaded European Dunkelflaute. But 50 Hertz has analyzed that, and those dark doldrums widely claimed to need months or seasons or even years of backup power turned out to need at most up to a week or two, totaling about 6% of winter electricity use. This long-assumed need for massive long-duration storage was not found, partly because the study included 4 of our 10 grid balancing resources, not 0 or 1. One last thought about markets. Energy transformations can flip markets with breathtaking speed. On Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1900, you have to look hard for the first car. 13 years later, you have to look even harder for the last horse. The horse and buggy industry thought it would have many decades to adapt, but Ford's Model T car got 62% cheaper in 13 years. Car-owning households soared from 8 to about 60% in a decade, 3/4 financed by a General Motors and DuPont innovation called car loans. Today, solar modules got 80% cheaper just now in 5 years. In fact, they got half cheaper last year alone. 3/4 of US rooftop solar is innovatively financed. Ford's and Edison's industries are merging to eat Rockefeller's industry. So the pace of transformation is set not by incumbents but by insurgents. They're not inhibited by the incumbents' business models or legacy assets or cultures. Moreover, investors flee before customers do, because capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And once they think you're in or even headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. Already trillions of dollars have prudently fled the global fossil fuel industries as they hemorrhage capital, talent, and clout. Before Putin's war, the world's top 16 listed hydrocarbon companies combined were worth less than Apple. All the world's significant automakers combined were worth less than Tesla. In the coming turbulence, customers may bypass any unloved suppliers. Many regulators must play catch-up. Pre-stranded assets will abound, and business as usual will become the riskiest thing you can do. So our responsibility and opportunity is to help enable the new energy system, not protect the old, to build back better, to move fast and fix things, so the global energy transformation can move at the pace and the cost of design and software, not of infrastructure, and can be not constrained by the inertia of incumbents, but sped by the ambition of insurgents, like many of you. Thank you for your good work and your kind attention.